We're going to look for an external problem that we've got to solve, and that is the situation regarding our Brexit negotiations with the EU, a stumbling block about international law, and there's nobody better for me to discuss that with than the former Attorney General, an expert on these matters, so I better be on my mettle here, Mr. Dominic Grieve. Dominic, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Dominic, thanks very much indeed. Now, Dominic, you will know the ins and outs of this legally right the way from the start to the finish. But could I just say to you, I saw a reference made by Sir Christopher Mayer yesterday, the former Washington ambassador, the UK ambassador to Washington. And Christopher said, this is a political problem, not a legal one. The failure of the EU to negotiate in good faith on the future relationship, with the result that, absent of an agreement, Northern Ireland becomes by default a gateway for EU law into Great Britain. So, Sir Christopher's put his opinion on the line there. He's basically saying to the legal officers, get your nose out of it and let the politicians sort it.
I can understand Sir Christopher's point, but how we've got ourselves into this situation is entirely the Prime Minister's doing. Let's just go back a year.
Yep.
We had a situation where Theresa May had negotiated a deal, and the deal had as absolutely at its root that the United Kingdom, although it wanted a close relationship with the EU, would be treated as a unit in future.
Yeah.
And that was the Northern Ireland backstop.
Mm-hmm.
Boris Johnson and his friends didn't like that. That's ultimately why Theresa May was overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
He then tried to take the United Kingdom out of the EU with no deal at all, or gave the impression he was willing to do it, and Parliament blocked him from doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so he then went and negotiated with the EU and with Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach of Ireland, a deal which he presented to Parliament at the end of October last year. And at the time, a lot of people, myself included, said, this is a really seriously bad deal when you start looking at the detail of it.
Mm-hmm.
For precisely the reasons that have just been, you've just spelt out.
Right.
And they then introduced the bill, second reading in the House of Commons, you may remember this, and said that we were going to have to consider the bill in 3 days. And some of us said, this is crazy, this is a major constitutional bill. And I expressed the view at the time that I thought that as we started looking at the detail, it would become obvious just how potentially dangerous and damaging it might be. And it's one of the reasons that I argued that if you're going to have such a deal, we ought to have another referendum, because the public do need to understand what the implications of this are. And there's a background to this, and that's the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. One of the consequences of the Good Friday Agreement is that we have an understanding in international law with Ireland about the way Northern Ireland is governed, which presupposed common membership of the EU. So disentangling that was always going to be very difficult. So I have all I would say, first point, is that this problem which has now arisen, which has led the government to take the action it has, is entirely the fault of Mr. Johnson.
Okay.
Because
all right, but
it is he decided to do it, and he must have either been doing one of two things. Either he was incompetent, or he was frankly dishonest and had decided from the outset that he was going to sign an international treaty, the terms of which he had already decided in his own mind he would be prepared to break further down the line. So that's point one. Then we move to where we are now, and where I think I also disagree somewhat. This is a legal issue. The United Kingdom is adherent as a state to what we call the international rules-based system. That is international law. Countries make agreements and stick by them. Sometimes, of course, they don't. For example, China has violated international law in enacting the legislation.
Happens all the time. The Europeans violate international law all the time, within their own bloc. They don't pass budgets. They allow people to exceed budgetary rules and regulations. The point is, Dominic, and you've had a long time to speak, so I'm not interrupting. But when this was drawn up, we expected the EU to deal with us, treating us as a sovereign state, and we wanted to be respected as a sovereign state.
Well,
and part of our sovereign state is Northern Ireland, and they want to use Northern Ireland as a backdoor to keep us in the EU. That's basically it, isn't it? That's basically it.
Well, look. Firstly, I think the characterisation you've just given is unsustainable. We don't actually know. It is unsustainable. I know Boris Johnson has written an article in the Daily Telegraph claiming that that is the intention of the EU. But I have to say, I've not seen this intention expressed openly by the European Union.
Well, they wouldn't express it openly, would they?
In the context of the Northern Ireland peace process, it would be very surprising for them to do this because of the rights of unionists. I say no more than that. I can see that it could be a potential problem, but there is absolutely no evidence, except Boris Johnson's say-so at present, that is their intention.
He's the Prime Minister. He represents us. He's got to make a decision. He decided...
I'm afraid I've come to the conclusion that the Prime Minister's word on most things is not to be relied upon.
I'm sorry, we can't go besmirching the Prime Minister just like that.
Bit of independent evidence before I will accept what the Prime Minister has to say to me.
Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, I'm sorry, Dominic, I'm sorry. Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, had the obligation to tighten that international law agreement up when he realised that it was detrimental to a part of the United Kingdom. The Europeans tried to do us on fishing. Then they tried to do us
me. Forgive me. What you are saying is completely and totally wrong.
It's an interpretation,
It is totally wrong. Suppose we were to leave with no deal on the 31st of January.
Yes, that wouldn't be a disaster.
And suppose thereafter the European Union were to seek to use the withdrawal agreement to do the nefarious things that you have just claimed, well, in those circumstances, although it would still be a breach of international law, I could at least see that there might be some moral authority to the Prime Minister suggesting the draconian course of action that he is now putting forward in Parliament. At the moment, it doesn't exist. And what he is actually doing is trashing the United Kingdom's reputation as a rule of law state, which means that in future, the UK will be in great difficulty in its international relations, and it's perfectly obvious that our European partners are perfectly understandably, actually, astonished that he should act in this fashion.
Right.
So you can't get away from that. Whatever the background problems may be, what he has decided to do in the course of the last week is effectively revolutionary, undermines the rule of law, is in breach of his own ministerial code, in breach of the Civil Service Code, and in breach of the oath of office of the Lord Chancellor. This is pretty drastic stuff.
No, they're all technicalities. David Cameron did exactly the same thing when he decided we are not going to allow prisoners to vote in this country, didn't he? And I would just like the EU to realise that if they had a proper trade relationship with us as an independent United Kingdom, they would benefit as much as we would. We'd all benefit from increased trade. But they're frightened. They're frightened. We're going to leave the EU and make a huge success of our independence, a huge success of standing on our own 2 feet. And if there's one thing the Europeans don't they don't like a state that decides to stand on its own 2 feet and not join their cosy little club which taxes people out of business.
Have you finished your rant?
I've finished.
That's what it sounds like a little bit.
I finished by putting my point over, Dominic. Yes.
It sounds a bit like a rant because I think you're conflating two different things. Firstly, you have strong views about the European Union.
Indeed.
In terms of their wanting Britain's departure from the EU to fail. It may be they do, and from my point of view, I want our departure from the EU because as we've left it now, to be as successful as possible.
Yes.
Although I did understand that the Prime Minister thought that the future trading relationship with the EU was very important. And I'm afraid I don't completely agree with you that the stumbling blocks that have emerged in the negotiations for a free trade agreement were unpredictable, or that they necessarily show the EU in some particularly hideous light. I would have thought they were capable of being solved, but perhaps I'm wrong, and as I'm not privy to the details of the negotiation, that's one thing.
Yes.
The second thing, which you conflate with it, you say David Cameron and prisoner voting. Actually, prisoner voting as an international law issue was solved by the United Kingdom about 2-3 years ago without any fuss or bother, and we are no longer in any problems in respect of our international law obligations.
I totally agree, because we stood up to the EU and we said no.
We didn't. It had nothing to do with the EU. Well, it had to do with the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights.
It was still an issue of international law. It's still an international law. No, Dominic, listen, I'm awfully sorry.
There are often areas of friction with
international
law, but the question you have to ask yourself is, if you're just prepared to tear up agreements which you don't like, why should anybody observe any of the agreements on which we rely? Just to give one example from the EU, we are about to take back possession.
Dominic, I'm awfully sorry, but we've
seas. How are we going to do that if somebody says, terribly sorry, you don't have an economic sea zone?
All right, Dominic, listen, I'm so grateful to you for coming on and giving me your time and all your opinions. I know you're an expert on this. We haven't got any more time to go. Let me just say one thing. Charles de Gaulle once said, international law is like a flower. It lasts as long as it lasts. And he was a great European statesman. Anyway, Dominic, thank you very much indeed. I have to say that was exhilarating, wasn't it? Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, adamant that if we break international law, we might lose face in the rest of the world. Can we be taken seriously? For my part, I say, look, the Europeans have been breaking their own laws for years with their own members. But there we are. Okay.